Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right into a seriously fascinating journey today, one that spans ancient, world-shaking crises, incredible philosophical resilience, and even a modern-day archaeological triumph. We are unpacking the massively complex, multi-layered legacy of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
Okay, let's dive into this. What exactly connects a looted, headless bronze statue, a deeply private diary that was literally never meant to be read by anyone, and a massive historical crisis that basically brought the mighty Roman Empire to its knees? Well, the answer is just one man, and more importantly, how his mind reacted to the entire world collapsing around him. Section 1. The Lost Emperor Returns. So, our story actually kicks off in the modern era with an absolute game-changer for cultural heritage. Imagine this. For over 60 years, a life-sized, headless bronze statue of Marcus Aurelius just sat there in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Turkey had been claiming for ages that it was illegally looted, but the museum pushed back, saying its origins couldn't be proven. It was a classic decades-long standoff. You're probably wondering, how did modern science finally break this deadlock? Well, it was this brilliant mashup of old-school detective work and cutting-edge archaeometry. First, investigators tracked down elderly witnesses who actually remembered the statue being looted back in the 1960s from Babon, an ancient site in Turkey. Then, researchers swooped in to analyze soil and lead isotope samples straight from that exact site. And guess what? They definitively matched the composition to the bronze statue itself. The science totally nailed it, leaving absolutely no room for doubt. And, this survival really highlights just how incredibly rare this artifact is. Back in antiquity, bronze was a super prized raw material. Whenever empires fell or, armies just needed quick weapons or coins, bronze statues were routinely melted down. So to have a life-sized bronze of an emperor actually survive the millennia, it's pretty much a historical miracle. It perfectly illustrates the sheer physical durability of Marcus Aurelius's legacy. Moving on to Section 2, Building the Inner Citadel. To truly understand this emperor, we need to shift our focus from that surviving physical bronze statue to something even more durable, his mind. Pierre Hadot, an incredibly renowned historian of ancient thought, spent over 2 decades analyzing Marcus's private writings. He wrote that the soul is in Marcus Aurelius's Stoic philosophy an inviolable stronghold of freedom, the inner citadel. What Hadot is getting at here is that for Marcus, Stoicism wasn't just some highbrow, abstract theory to debate at dinner parties. No, it was a highly practical, everyday tool for psychological survival. It's actually fascinating to see the profound difference in how Marcus approached the world compared to later thinkers like St. Paul or St. Augustine. Where those later traditions leaned heavily into faith-based doctrines, requiring unquestioning belief and submission to a higher power, Marcus's philosophy was intensely action-based. He frankly didn't care much about sophisticated rhetoric or purely theoretical words. His intense focus was on tangible, ethical behavior and our actual, day-to-day relationships with our fellow human beings. Section 3. The 3 Stoic Disciplines. Now, what's really interesting here is how Marcus actually built this inner citadel. He used a strict psychological framework heavily inspired by his teacher, Epictetus, a former slave turned prominent philosopher. The first rule, the discipline of assent, teaches us that external events don't actually perturb us. Only our internal judgments about those events do. It's all about training the mind to clearly separate objective reality from our own subjective emotional spin, realizing that true freedom lies only in our own judgments. Next up, we have the discipline of desire. This one is entirely about recognizing the limits of our control. It means accepting the events brought to us by the course of nature with complete serenity. You've probably heard of the concept Amor Fati. Well, this is it. It's not just tolerating your fate, but actually loving it and embracing what you simply cannot change. Finally, we wrap up this framework with the discipline of action. This is a crucial point, because Stoicism definitely isn't about isolating yourself on some lonely mountaintop. This discipline recognizes our common human bond and strictly demands that we act ethically, generously, and always in the service of our fellow humans. Section 4. Rome's Pathogen Bong. Now, it's one thing to practice philosophy in a comfortable, quiet room. It is an entirely different beast to have it stress-tested in real time by a terrifying historical crucible. During Marcus's reign, a long era of peace completely shattered. Let's trace this timeline. In 165 CE, a deadly outbreak pops up in Mesopotamia after a Roman military campaign. By 166, returning troops inadvertently bring it straight into Rome. The city was densely packed, highly urbanized, basically a massive pathogen bomb waiting to go off. Rome's incredibly efficient trade networks suddenly acted like superhighways for the disease. By 168, it was ravaging the entire empire, and by 169, it even killed Marcus's own co-emperor, Lucius Burrus.
The famous Roman physician Galen was actually living in Rome right then, and his accounts of the symptoms are, frankly, absolutely horrific. Victims suffered from skyrocketing fevers, terrifying black cutaneous lesions, and pustules all over their skin, and they were literally coughing up scabs and blood. Combine that with internal hemorrhaging, gangrene, and severe diarrhea. Based on these incredibly grim details, modern science widely identifies this nightmare as a highly lethal strain of hemorrhagic smallpox.
Which brings us to Section 5, an empire in crisis.
So the crucial point is how this unprecedented medical catastrophe triggered a totally bizarre economic inversion across the empire. Because the plague wiped out such a massive portion of the workforce, labor became incredibly scarce, which made wages completely skyrocket. Simultaneously, with so many tragic deaths, land became abruptly abundant and totally abandoned, causing land prices to just plummet. But interestingly enough, wheat prices stayed pretty stable, simply because Egypt managed to keep its massive export operations running. And while the economy was flipping upside down, Rome's enemies definitely weren't taking a break. Germanic tribes started breaching the northern borders. The Roman army had been absolutely decimated by the disease while sitting in their winter camps. So Marcus Aurelius had to take some incredibly desperate actions just to keep the war machine breathing. We're talking emergency conscriptions, literally drafting slaves and gladiators into the legions. He debased the silver coinage, and to fund the campaigns, he actually held a massive auction of his own personal imperial palace treasures. When the dust finally started to settle years later, the estimated death toll was just staggering. Anywhere from 7 to 10 million people had perished. Let that sink in. To put that into perspective, presenting a number like that really hits home the sheer scale of devastation across a deeply interconnected ancient world. In absolute terms, it was literally the worst disease event in human history up to that point.
Section 6, the enduring Stoic legacy.
We've explored the physical survival of his bronze statue and the terrifying reality of the plague that nearly broke his world. Now let's return to Pierre Hadot, who beautifully notes, "The Meditations are treasured today as an inexhaustible source of wisdom. For centuries they have brought reasons to live to innumerable unknown people." Think about how powerful that is. Marcus's private, desperate notes, forged in the fires of an empire-ending plague and endless grueling border wars, have quite literally brought reasons to live to millions of people over the centuries. And honestly, this perfectly illustrates the ultimate historical irony. Marcus Aurelius firmly believed in the Stoic principle that everything is soon forgotten, that all human glory eventually just fades away to nothing. Yet this intensely private journal, a simple set of self-admonitions written by a guy just trying to hold his mind together in the darkest of times, was never meant for our eyes. It was never intended for publication. But it completely outlived the empire itself, immortalizing him for nearly 2,000 years. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. In a modern world that is still constantly facing its own unpredictable, chaotic crises, is a 2,000-year-old philosophy from a plague-ridden Roman emperor exactly what we need to build our own inner citadel? It's certainly something to deeply consider the next time you find yourself facing an obstacle you simply cannot control. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep building your citadel.